In this program, you'll see how the English colonies were established, what contributed to their success, and how they differed. You'll learn about brave individuals like Roger Williams and Margaret Brent, who went against the social customs of their time to realize their visions of a better world. And you'll see how the Native Americans struggled to hold on to their way of life as they witnessed the spread of English colonial power across their land. When the colony of Plymouth was founded in 1620 by pilgrims who sailed on the Mayflower, it began as a poor, small, isolated community. Native peoples of the region lived their lives largely undisturbed in centuries-old rhythms of hunting, fishing, and planting. But the small colony continued to grow. Each year, the pilgrims sent a cargo of lumber and fur to England in return for the supplies they needed to survive. In England, conflicts over religion continued to grow. Although the official Church of England was the Anglican Church, there were people who held different religious beliefs. Anyone who did not agree with the Anglican practices was called a dissenter. One group of dissenters were the Puritans. Puritans found life in England unbearable under the reign of King James I and his successor in 1625, King Charles. Inspired by the Pilgrims, the purest of the Puritans, they decided it was time to go to America. In 1630, the Great Migration from England to New England began. 1,000 Puritans arrived in Massachusetts Bay in 15 ships. 4 years later, it was 10,000, and by 1643, 20,000 colonists. The Massachusetts Bay colonists, under Governor John Winthrop, believed they had a covenant, an agreement with God to create a holy society, something they called a city upon a hill, because they hoped that others would see and copy their example. Church and law were one and the same thing for the Puritans. Any adult male could participate in elections as long as he belonged to the church. A great many of the Puritan leaders were men educated in Europe's leading universities. They placed great stock in education. In 1638, the Reverend John Harvard, dying at the age of 30, left half his fortune and 400 books to a fledgling college begun 2 years earlier in a small house in a cow yard. The town called it Harvard College. Soon, the first printing press in the English colonies was set up to publish psalms and an almanac. All along the coast of Massachusetts, Puritans settled small towns: Salem, Boston, Concord. At first, they directed their efforts to farming and selling their surplus to newcomers. Soon, however, they began a brisk trade with the West Indies, well-established colonies in the Caribbean that had a demand for cured meats, grain, and ships. Contrary to popular depiction, Puritans were not dour, humorless people who always dressed in black. They made bright-colored furniture, clothing, and art, ornate silverware, and rugged ships. However, the Puritans created a society that was surprisingly intolerant of people who were different from them, people, for instance, like the Native Americans. They tried repeatedly to convert the Indians to Christianity. Those who complied were segregated into Indian praying towns, created largely to serve the needs of the colonists.
What we usually mean by praying towns are a series of towns inhabited by Christianized Indians, mostly organized under the Reverend John Eliot, who, among other things, translated the whole Bible into Algonquian. The first Bible published anywhere in North America was Eliot's Indian Bible. And he tried to organize these towns in a way which would produce strongly Protestant Algonquian Indians. This is a tough sell for Indians. Most Indians did not think, in my favorite Puritan phrase, that their best deeds stank in the nostrils of the Lord.
The Wampanoag, the original friends of the Pilgrim Fathers, were now getting squeezed out of their ancestral territory through uncertain real estate transactions. Their leader, Metacom, called King Philip by the English because of his taste for English fashion, began developing a plan to push back. The Nipmuc, too, were feeling extreme pressure between the settlements in eastern Massachusetts and the Connecticut River, but dared not move further west for fear of the dreaded Mohawk. Roger Williams was one among the Puritans who stood up for religious freedom and for the Indians. He was repeatedly brought before the court in Salem for spreading dangerous opinions. He suggested, for example, that the rightful owners of the land were the Native Americans. He also tried to convince Europeans to learn the native languages and customs. Williams argued strongly against the conversion of Native Americans to Christianity. Finally, cast out of Salem in 1635, he and a few followers made their way to Narragansett Bay and started their own colony, Rhode Island, based upon the principles of religious freedom and representative government. There, he welcomed Quakers, Jews, Catholics, and those with no religious belief at all. He was greatly admired by the Narragansett tribespeople, and he lived among them, studying their language and ways. Another independent thinker who soon joined Williams was Anne Hutchinson. In Puritan Boston, she had been put on trial for holding public discussions about religion in her home. Banished for heresy, she escaped to Rhode Island with her followers, husband, and 13 children. She felt that people did not need to attend church, that finding God was an internal, personal quest. She met Roger Williams, who helped her family purchase Aquidneck Island from the Narragansett Indian tribe. They called their colony Portsmouth. Tragically, Hutchinson and most of her children died in an Indian revolt, massacred in the woods of New York State in 1643. Anne Hutchinson is remembered as a spiritual leader, a midwife, and the organizer of the first women's group in America.
Anne Hutchinson is important for a number of reasons, among them being that she challenges the religious establishment of the time, that she raises a new set of questions about what religion is and what it should be, and how one becomes saved. She's a bright woman, she's an educated woman, she's a radical woman, and those things were all frightening to the 17th century mind.
In 1644, King Charles I granted an official charter to Rhode Island. The charter was the first to officially separate the laws of the church from the laws of the state. Representative government, religious tolerance, separation of church and state, these important principles established in Rhode Island would guide the colonies along the path to democracy in the century ahead. Other Puritans left the Massachusetts Bay Colony for New Hampshire, Maine, and Connecticut. Some, like Quaker Mary Dyer, were persecuted or hanged for their religious beliefs. Many sought privacy, a greater say in how they were governed, and richer farmland, but the quest for land came at a tremendous cost to the native inhabitants. Native Americans and colonists had different ideas about land ownership. Tribespeople felt that they should still have access to land for hunting purposes, even if they had agreed to let colonists use it. This was because they believed that the land was sacred and could not be owned by anyone. Colonists did not understand and disregarded this concept. Often, they took land by force. Sometimes, Native Americans were sold into slavery in the West Indies. Worst of all, tribes were slowly dying from European diseases they could neither comprehend nor resist. Finally, in 1675, the chief of the Wampanoag, Metacom, or King Philip, united with the Nipmuc to fight against the English colonists. King Philip's war raged for 2 years and was the bloodiest per capita in American history. The natives attacked settlement upon settlement, burning down every building they encountered and killing the inhabitants. They began in Massachusetts and the Connecticut River Valley, and were soon joined on the warpath by the Pocumtuck, Squatees, and Norwotkies.
In King Philip's War, the biggest shock that the settlers experienced was that in virtually all the early actions, the Indians won. For one thing, the settlers marched like a European militia. They made all kinds of clanking noise, and going through what they called the wilderness or the forest, the Indians had no trouble figuring out where they were and where they were heading, and consequently they did things like pick off the settlers' officers. They almost always hit something when they shot, whereas the settlers were trained like Europeans just to point a musket towards an enemy and fire a volley. So in all the early actions, one finds the Indians winning these struggles, and that turns around in the Great Swamp Fight in December 1675, when the settlers did wipe out a very large number of Narragansett Indians in the so-called Narragansett country. Mostly women and children are the victims of this particular attack, and that also increased the number of Indian enemies, though.
The Narragansett thirst for revenge knew no bounds. They entered the war and joined the renewed raids on dozens of settlements. Hundreds of colonists met brutal death. Scores were taken captive as ransom for food and supplies. Yet, despite the frightful offensive, the Indians' power was declining.
The turning point in the military struggle was when the Mohawks intervened. They lived west of Albany. They intervened and attacked King Philip's winter camp and carried off most of the wives and children of the warriors, and also prevented Philip from replenishing his gunpowder supply. Without gunpowder, all that they had learned about muskets was of no use to them, and they then really lose virtually all of the engagements in 1676 because they just don't have the arms anymore to do what they had done before. So the war turns decisively against them in the spring or so of 1676.
The Puritans won, but many settlements were destroyed in fiery raids. By 1700, the 4 major colonies in New England had recovered. Massachusetts Bay Colony, Rhode Island, Connecticut, and New Hampshire had been established, but relations between the Native Americans and the colonists had soured, never to be mended. The Puritans were not the only persecuted religious group that fled to the New World. In England, devout Catholic Cecilius Calvert inherited his father's land grant in the northern Chesapeake. Cecilius sent his younger brother Leonard to serve as the expedition's leader and Maryland's first governor on 2 ships, the Ark and the Dove, loaded with Catholic and Protestant immigrants. They called the founding site and first capital of Maryland St. Mary's City. By negotiating for a parcel of land and village site with the Yaocomaco Indians, the colonists were provided with immediate shelter, cultivated lands, and access to the Chesapeake Bay and trade routes. In exchange for axes, hoes, cloth, and hatchets, the settlers moved in, sharing the villages with the Yaocomaco for the first year. In this way, they were able to avoid the starving times experienced at Plymouth and Jamestown. 2 years before Roger Williams established Rhode Island, Maryland was a place where all Christians could practice their religion freely. Hence, Maryland soon had a variety of Protestants, including socially radical Quakers. And like Anne Hutchinson in Rhode Island, this spirit of toleration inspired a strong woman named Margaret Brent to take her place in history. Margaret and her sister Mary owned land in Maryland and operated a successful plantation called Sisters Freehold. Margaret represented herself, her family members, and even her neighbors in court.
Margaret Brent was the first woman to be given such power in Maryland, and her sister married the governor of Maryland, married Calvert, who then became much more aware of Margaret Brent and of her business acumen, and made her the executor of his will. In that capacity, she became known to many people as an economic powerhouse, and she acquired more land, acquired more stature as an economic thinker in Maryland, And finally, she moved from Maryland to Virginia, where she did the same thing over the course of the end of her life.
Lord Baltimore granted rights to land in return for the transportation of settlers. The first investors received rights to 2,000 acres for every 5 individuals and 100 acres per person for fewer than 5. Later, these grants were reduced to 50 acres per person, brought to Maryland. While settlers in New England were Puritan almost to the man, colonists in the South came from many different backgrounds, from lord to convicted felon. Indentured servitude, most common in the South and Middle colonies, was a system by which people contracted themselves and their labor for several years to the lord of a manor. In this way, many men and women who could neither afford passage across the Atlantic nor a homestead were able to come to the colonies. Often they learned a trade, and at the end of their service received the rights to 50 acres, tools, and a new suit of clothes. At the same time, another group of people began to arrive, the Africans.
In the 17th century, the typical laboring person in the American colonies, particularly in Virginia and Maryland, was a white indentured servant, usually a young man. Most of the Africans who started arriving in 1619 in small numbers for most of the 17th century were also young men. We now think that most of them, from at least 1640 on, arrived as slaves. That is, the people who bought them expected them to serve for life, and they were in the process of deciding that anybody who serves for life, probably that person's descendants will also be enslaved. But we do know that there was an interesting minority of Africans who were treated as indentured servants, who did win their freedom, and who left trails in the records of early Virginia and early Maryland.
The laws that established slavery as perpetual, inheritable, and tied to race come into Maryland and Virginia in the 1660s, at roughly the same time that the Royal African Company begins bringing slaves in under the aegis of England. Prior to that, we have Africans coming in from 1619 on, in 30s, 40s, 50s, on small ships. And many of them, the ones who came in prior to 1650, were treated like indentured servants. That is, they worked a certain number of years, and then they were freed and perhaps given land.
A small number of free blacks had, in fact, become wealthy, owning slaves and servants, both black and white. But by far, the dominant colonist was a white, middle-class male who acquired land via the headright system, acquiring more and more land to grow tobacco, Virginia's primary cash crop, and importing more servants and slaves in order to grow it. In the Royal Colony of Virginia, slavery became fully established in the late 1600s with the enactment of the Black Codes.
The Black Codes are actually a series of laws instituted locally, colony by colony, and they have different meanings in each different colony. In most places, an African American couldn't own property, couldn't participate in the legislative process, couldn't travel except under certain controlled circumstances. Some places wouldn't let African Americans gather without a white person present. There were controls about the relationship between African Americans and Native Americans. They couldn't visit with Native Americans. Intermarriage was often forbidden. A range of things that increasingly after 1660 set African Americans apart into a separate society.
Like Maryland, the Carolinas also began as land grants. In 1633, King Charles II granted property south of Virginia to 8 friends. They founded a settlement at Charleston in 1670. Charleston soon became the busiest port in the South. A few wealthy people held most of the power and imported many slaves to work the rice and indigo crops. Eventually, there were more enslaved Africans than there were whites in South Carolina. In contrast to the colonies north and south were the middle colonies of New York and New Jersey. In 1626, the Dutch West India Company sent Peter Minuit to be the first Director General of New Netherland, a string of fur-trading forts along the Hudson River. That same year, Minuit traded with the Indians for the use of Manhattan Island, paying the equivalent of 60 guilders, or $24. On the southern tip of the island, a fort was built. It was called New Amsterdam and became the capital of New Netherland, later evolving into New York City.
The Dutch founded the first ethnically and religiously diverse society in North America. Even to call New Netherland Dutch is a bit misleading because the settlers included everybody involved in the Dutch North Sea trade. So you get Danes and Norwegians and Swedes and Scots and Englishmen and Germans and French, and there's a Jesuit priest who visited New Amsterdam in 1643 and claimed that there were 18 languages being spoken in a city with fewer than 1,000 people at that point.
And it was also a population that included the largest number of slaves outside the South. The proportion of slaves in the New York population was about 30%, which was very high for the North, and in fact was high for the South. And the Dutch had had an experience of bringing in slaves with the West India Company since the early part of the 17th century. And so there was a slave population already in place, a Native American trading population already in place, and an urban population in New York City, which was the hub of that mix.
Eventually, the Dutch encouraged settlement by patroons, anyone who could bring 50 people to the new colony. Patroons were rewarded with 15 miles of riverfront land on the Hudson River, which they ran as feudal lords. King Charles II of England despised the Dutch and decided to take their lucrative lands in the New World away. He gave it by decree, along with the territory that would become New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Maine, to his brother, the Duke of York. The Duke immediately sent 4 ships to New York Harbor to demand the Dutch governor's surrender. Peter Stuyvesant, unable to rally any resistance at all, surrendered the most valuable real estate of its size in the world without firing a single shot.
So when the English arrive and conquer the place in 1664, they believe that they're going to get an English society and that the Dutch are going to somehow magically turn English. What happens is it's mostly single English men who come to New York who then marry Dutch women in the course of the 17th century, and the English find that their children are growing up speaking Dutch rather than English, so that it's a long time, really, before New York, New Amsterdam, New York City becomes a truly English city. It has a very distinctive Dutch flavor, I would say, down to about the middle of the 18th century.
Next, the Duke of York carved off a large slice of his holdings for his friend Sir George Carteret and Lord John Berkeley. This would become the colony of New Jersey. Sparsely populated at the time, the new lords proprietors offered very liberal terms to encourage settlement, including freedom of conscience and representative assembly. In 1681, the Duke of York paid off a debt to William Penn with an even larger land grant. Penn founded his colony squarely on the principles of religious liberty and equality, cornerstones of both the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, each signed into existence in the colony's center, Philadelphia, 100 years later. William Penn was a Quaker, and the Quakers were destined to play a far greater role in American history than their small numbers might suggest. They believed that the direct word of God dwelt in the human soul and could be heard without need of Bible, minister, or church. Believing all men to be equal, Quakers called one another friend. Penn offered similar terms to those of Lord Baltimore, and for £100 gave a 5,000-acre country estate plus a sizable plot in the city of Philadelphia. Colonists arrived in droves, for Philadelphia was no wilderness. Several hundred Swedes and Finns were already there. Later would come Mennonites from Germany and Quakers from Wales. Within a few short years, Philadelphia boasted brick kilns, tanneries and brassworks, paper mills, and printing presses. Whales were hunted in the Delaware Bay, and trade with the West Indies was brisk. Pennsylvania was the model for the America to come, a true melting pot. William Penn was tall and charming, not yet 40, and governor of all he saw. He brokered an unwavering peace with the Native Americans in his vicinity and wrote a constitution for Pennsylvania that survived until 1776. At the turn of the 18th century, England boasted 4 well-established colonies in New England: Massachusetts Bay, New Hampshire, Rhode Island, and Connecticut. The English had acquired the middle colonies of New York and New Jersey, and William Penn had established Pennsylvania, Delaware. In the South, the Chesapeake colonies of Maryland and Virginia flourished. Finally, North and South Carolina were beginning to grow. In the West Indies, the English controlled Jamaica and Barbados. All in all, a total of 500,000 souls were under English jurisdiction in the New World. But the English would find it increasingly difficult to control wayward sons and daughters whose new values, freedom and equality, had taken root in new lives. The Massachusetts Bay colonists under Governor John Winthrop believed they had a covenant with God to create a holy society. Roger Williams established the colony Rhode Island based upon the principles of religious freedom and representative government. Native Americans and colonists had different ideas about land ownership. Indians resisted the colonists fiercely in King Philip's War, but were defeated. Slavery became fully established in the late 1600s with the enactment of the Black Codes.